Thank you for tuning in to the Street Writer, the Word Warrior podcast. My name is Noah, aka Big Mex, and we're going through the abridged history of the brawling genre. So when we last left off, we talked about one of the greatest video games of all time. Not just one of the greatest brawlers, but one of the greatest video games. And that was Guardian Heroes, which originally appeared on the Sega Saturn. So now we're going to see some of the other gems that came out in the 90s when the genre was starting to fade away. By 1997, developers were shifting away from brawlers and arcade games altogether and focusing more on home console development. Those that chose to support the arcade did so because they were either large publishers that depended on the support of all markets, or they were a new company trying to establish themselves in the industry. The latter was the case for IGS, the International Game System, a company founded in Taiwan in 1989. IGS had set up an arcade board system called PGM, short for Poly Games Master. It was similar to SNK and their Neo Geo in that the boards came on large cartridges and could be swapped out by arcade owners relatively easily. Up until that point, the company had produced a new game once every few years, and oftentimes it was following the tail end of a trend. They had a few notable titles in their time, but the first one of real merit was Oriental Legend. Up until that point, players had seen just about every theme, location, and license that they could in the arcade brawler. The majority were set in the West, even though the developers were clearly Japanese. As a proud Taiwanese company with roots in China, IGS countered the trend by creating a cartoon-style brawler with characters based on classic Asian mythology, specifically the epic Journey to the West poems. The game was a good first attempt at the genre. Its large sprites, bright colors, and animations made the title feel slightly dated. Granted, by this point, most arcade players had been spoiled by the art and animation featured in the Capcom and Konami games. However, IGS was smart in that their title featured characters, situations, levels, and villains that could be easier for players in their target markets, Taiwan, China, and Korea, to recognize. Those countries would become economic powerhouses over the next decade, and IGS was smart enough to give young gamers living there something to play. By comparison, Capcom was simply going through the motions on their next and final arcade brawler. Battle Circuit was a fun diversion, but also a grim reminder of the state of sprite-based gaming. It was built on the CPS-2 engine, just as the other notable Capcom brawlers were. By 1997, the graphics engine appeared dated, regardless of what designs, locations, or characters the game was wrapped around. Battle Circuit was an over-the-top brawler with designs that lampooned Western and Eastern tastes alike. All of the characters, both good and evil, were well done. It would benefit game designers and artists working in the industry today to study the works featured in Battle Circuit. It was urban, it was sci-fi, it was horror, and it was everything in between. Unfortunately, it was also a dated experience. Capcom had milked every last drop out of the CPS-2, and developing a brawler for the CPS-3 would be out of the question, as it would have been more expensive and time-consuming process given the advanced architecture of the hardware. The first decade of the brawler was good to players and the industry. The next decade would see the genre barely manage to survive. We're going to take a closer look at some of the games that managed to get by. The game industry was quickly shifting. By 1998, polygon-based titles were becoming more prevalent in arcades, and even home consoles were becoming capable of processing decent 3D graphics, complete with textures and lighting effects. The era of the sprite was quickly coming to an end, and the genres that depended on it would have to evolve or die.
Roger, we got a bad situation now.
Sega started the shift with brawlers to 3D with Dynamite Cop/Die Hard Arcade. It borrowed the classic formula of having up to 2 players take on scores of bad guys. In this case, it was a male and female police officer against terrorists, tattooed goons, thugs, and rogue cops. There were even outlandish boss battles against giant characters and even monstrous creatures. Despite being built with 3D polygons instead of sprites, the game actually kept the 2D gameplay. Characters could only face left or right. Fighting or shooting at opponents diagonally was out of the question. While this made little sense to gamers, it worked in favor of the gameplay itself. The title also featured QuickTime events where the character would be seen running down a corridor. A prompt would have the player punch, kick, or jump. If the player was successful, then they would avoid a battle with opponents and move directly onto the next stage. For a first attempt at a 3D brawler, Sega played it safe with the gameplay and gave audiences a fun title. Sega followed up Dynamite Cop with a true 3D brawler that same year. Spike Out Digital Battle Online. Having more experience with polygon-based fighting engines than any other studio gave Sega a certain advantage. In the title, a gang of 4 people, Spike, White, Linda, and Tension, collectively called Team Spike, were going through a city to reclaim it from a crime lord. Players fought every possible brawling type of character, from lowly thugs and tattooed henchmen to yakuza in fine suits and riot police in full armor. Where it differed from every other brawler up to that point was that the environments were free-roaming 3D. Players were not limited by the pseudo 3D layout in sprite-based games, nor were they limited to being only able to face left or right while fighting opponents. For the first time in any brawler, they could explore the levels and face wave after wave of enemy in all 360 degrees. This both excited and terrified gamers. When the combat was limited to left and right, then players could see which opponents were the biggest threat and set up attacks in advance. When players were surrounded, they might be able to handle a few characters in front or to the sides, but when opponents went from the back or a blind spot, then the player was at a loss. This made the game and the gameplay much more difficult. I first saw the title in an advertisement on the pages of Gamest magazine. It's a Japanese arcade game magazine. In it, Spike was dropping an elbow from a fire escape some 2 or 3 stories up onto an unseen opponent. My eyes widened and my heart started pounding at the thought of being able to do whatever I wanted in a fight on a completely open 3D world. As much fun as I had been having with the Final Fight series, I was wondering what would it be like to perform impossible attacks onto opponents in 3D. I wanted to find out if the elbow drop from the top of a building was indeed possible in the game. Never before in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would be able to do that in a video game, let alone in a multiplayer brawler. Thankfully for me, there was an arcade in Irvine that had a special every Thursday night. For $20, players could play every game in the massive arcade as many times as they wanted from about 6 p.m. to midnight. My coworkers and brothers took advantage of this and beat scores of new and classic games over the months. The arcade had a 4-player setup of Spike Out, which was not what I had expected. Each player got a single cabinet that was connected via LAN to the other machines. Sega in Japan had designed this cabinet with the idea that players would be able to drop in and out of the brawling adventure at any point in the story, whether they were in the same arcade or in another arcade connected to the Sega network. It was a revolutionary concept for arcade games to be connected on a network, and important for the survival of brawling games to always have someone to play with. My brothers and I each had our own screens and were free to roam about the levels, fighting gang members until being pointed out to the direction of the boss character. The fighting was frenetic and difficult. It was completely different gameplay than what we were used to, not as easy or enjoyable as we had expected. The difficulty aside, Spike Out exposed several flaws with the format. I was the biggest supporter of the brawler, but even I found it very redundant. Assuming that there were the same numbers of opponents that players had to fight in both 2D and 3D games, in 3D the battles seemed to take longer and made players feel less invincible than the classic brawling heroes. In 2D, opponents could be stunned or dropped with a few hits, and new opponents would step in to take their place. In Spike Out and future 3D brawlers, opponents could sidestep or even block strikes, so that players would have to keep trying different moves in order to knock them down. By that time, they were often getting hit by opponents closing in from the sides or from behind. The worst thing was having the attacks miss an opponent because they were a few degrees off to the right or left. The game engine did not autocorrect the trajectory for the player. Some of these things were resolved with Spike Out Final Edition, released a year later, but not having these concessions made before the game was released was a mistake. For my brothers and I, playing and beating the game a couple of times was enough to satisfy my curiosity. Actually, I wasn't satisfied with the game until I got a chance to drop an elbow onto an opponent from a few stories up. In one level, set inside a mall, my friends and brothers were battling a boss character. I told them to keep him busy while I climbed to the top of the stage. I went up about 5 or 6 virtual stories, jumped onto the railing, and launched myself over with an elbow drop. I missed the boss, but landed on his henchman with a high-speed thud. My brothers were laughing as I seemed to appear out of nowhere on their screen. My health bar did not suffer from the stunt, so I kept running up and dropping elbows from the rafters. It was a glorious thing from an otherwise lackluster brawling experience. The shift to 3D had begun, but some genres did not seem to make the transition smoothly. The following year would see 2 studios try to keep the traditional sprite-based brawlers alive. I hope to see you return for the next episode. Again, thank you for tuning in. My name is Noah, aka Big Mex. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sponsoring me on Patreon. If you visit Patreon, I go by Street Writer. So thanks for tuning in. We're going to keep going on brawlers, so I'll see you in the next episode.